This is the fifth webinar in a series of 6 webinars that overall about B2B SaaS pricing. Today, I'm going to talk about expansion and renewals, and the whole sort of webinar series is here. So we started out end of August with SaaS packaging, then we touched upon price models, then service design and pricing in B2B SaaS, and then we had a break for a week. I was in the US with a client. And then we were last week back with terms, discounts, and promotions. And then today we're going to do expansion revenue and renewals. And then we're going to finish off with next week, where I'll walk you through how to run a B2B SaaS pricing project. So what the methodology is, and who to involve when, and what to do, and so forth. So, but today is all about expansion revenue and renewals. And the format is as it usually is, which I'm going to give a presentation for about 30 minutes or so, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. And Q&A works in the following way. Out to the right, you have something called chat here in Riverside, and that is a sort of little sort of regular sort of chat stream. Everybody can write there, but because of the way that it's set up with you guys as an audience, you can't sort of speak sort of verbally your questions. You have to write it there. But just write it, as soon as you think of it, because what I will do is I will go through the questions from top down. So you don't need to sort of wait to the end for the Q&A to begin to write your question. Just put it in there and we'll write it. If we run out of time, we will go to I will take the remaining questions and I will answer them over in the school community. So at the beginning in webinar 1, I created a community page over on school.com. So that's school with a K. /SaaS-pricing/about. I think that's sort of where you get access to it. And I think actually we have 450 members in there. And it's like, it's a really, really, I think, unique group of people. We have a lot of commercial people. We have a lot of product people. We have a lot of founders and sort of chief executives. And then we have a lot of sort of pure pricing professionals. And everybody's talking about, anything pricing related. So the collective brain in that community can definitely answer your question there. So that's also where you're going to find the recording of this webinar, and also the recording of all the previous webinars and all the slides there and so forth. So just go to the school forum and, learn more about pricing. Okay. So the agenda for today on expansion is that I'm going to go through, let's say, 4 different sections of the presentation. I'm going to talk about first what I call the expansion cube. And then I'm going to talk about land and expand. That's a little bit of rant. But I have something to get off my chest around, what I think, what the purpose of expansion is, and what sort of the pitfalls are when thinking about expansion, because I think it's almost pure positive. And I think actually there's a little bit of negative that needs to be taken into account in order to do it well. And then I'm going to talk about what I call the 2 expansion tracks. So how to think about expansion, how to sort of design for it in the way that you're offering, the pricing and packaging is set up. And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about renewals and how to actually sort of structure those and what I think drives renewals. So that's going to be it. I'm going to run for about sort of 30 minutes on that. Hopefully, I'm going to keep the time, and then we're going to have questions. We are going to end 5 minutes early today because I have another call. So that's it. So we're going to end 3:55 today, but it'll be fine. And then any other questions, go to the school forum and I'll get to them later today. Okay. So with that, let's get started. We have the expansion cube, and I call the expansion cube 3D value. And the idea is that you can only grow your account value, your annual contract value, in 3 ways. There is no other ways. So either you can take the existing account that you have and then you can sell them something else, so something that they're not buying today. Or you can sell them more of something that they are already buying. So that might be more users, and sell them new stuff, might be another module, add-on, or new tier. And then finally, the third thing you can do is you can raise prices. So you can charge more for the things that you're selling. And the idea is that, and this is sort of the traditional sort of cross-sell, upsell, and price point discussion. But what I think a lot of people miss, and they might sort of know it mathematically or conceptually, but it's almost one of these things that you must sort of know it by heart to really understand how to drive value. And that is that they compound. So each of these, let's call them dimensions, multiply customer value, and then the product of them multiply each other. So let me demonstrate. So if you have a customer and they have maybe 50% of the product that they ideally could or should use. I'm keeping it deliberately vague here, but let's say you have an awesome product and you have customers that are sort of not buying everything, they're buying some things, and you really feel that they are somehow underpurchased. And they're maybe only buying, let's say, 50% of the users. So let's say you have sales software and they're buying 2 modules and not 4, and they have 20 salespeople, but they're only buying 10 seats. Very regular, normal case. And let's say that for those 2 modules with the 10 seats, you're actually only charging half of what they might even be willing to pay. If this is the case, then you actually have an 800% expansion opportunity, right? Because if you sold them all the product, you would double the purchase. If you sold them all the users, you would double it again. So now it's 4x. And then if you charged at value, what they were actually willing to pay, you would double it again. So now it would be an 8x opportunity. And the way that I visualize this is exactly with a cube. So as when you grow on one dimension, let's say functionality used, or you grow on the price dimension, or you grow on the number of units, let's say number of users, number of whatever metric you use, like number of gigabytes or like active store locations or whatever it is that your software does, it actually multiplies the other things as well. And I use this very actively in the way that I set up my pricing projects when I do the, let's say, the analysis initially in entering into a project. I'm just going to give you a case here. So I'm currently working with a US-based client. They are, like say in the HR space, and they do about 100 million a year ARR, and they have a bunch of enterprise customers, and that's all fine. And if we sort of break it down and say, okay, so these 400 enterprise customers, give and take, let's sort of figure out how much of the ideal functionality are they using? Like how much could we potentially sell them more of the stuff that we already have compared to what they're using today? And then how many users do they have or licenses compared to the, let's say, number of licenses that, they actually have, let's say, across all their divisions or nationalities or, vehicles or whatever it is. And then how much are we charging them? And then what I'm getting is I'm getting these sort of feedbacks from the executives that I'm engaged with and say, okay, what is your sort of estimate of these numbers? And then we figure out that it's sort of 80% of ideal functionality, 70% of units, and sort of 50% of willingness to pay. And if you take that on the 100 million ARR base and say, okay, so that means that the ideal ARR, if we're able to maximize all of the 3 dimensions, would take the 100 million ARR you have to 357 million, right? So it's 100 million divided by 0.8, divided by 0.7, divided by 0.50. And that gets us to 357. So they have this sort of plus 257% expansion opportunity sitting in their existing customer base where they say, well, we don't even have to sell another account and we could still, more than triple the business. And then you have to look at, okay, so what are the actual project targets? So even if we did only half of each of the targets, like we only capture half of the product gap, half of the metric gap, and half of the pricing gap, and we even account for some churn, we still have a 57%, so an uplift to 157 million sort of perspective in this project. And this is just one of the things that is just really powerful to try and analyze with whatever business you have. It's like, hey, how much of the product are my customers actually using compared to what they should be using? And how many units am I selling? And what am I actually charging? And even if you're off a little bit, it might give you some idea of where the potential is. And that's actually sort of part of the point here is that since they are multiplying on each other, since these sort of 3 factors compound, they're not necessarily equally important to work on. So if you have this case where you say, okay, so my customers are buying 1 module and they should buy 5, let's say, but actually they have like almost all of the users because we're really good at selling them additional users to whatever they have. And the price might be a little lower. So let's say that it's sort of 80% of willingness to pay. Maybe we have one segment that's a bit off, but we don't think that it's sort of a massive opportunity. Like doing the math, you would have a 690% expansion opportunity But if you break it down, the majority of that sits in the functionality. And we might even with something like this say, let's just ignore selling more users or ignore pricing completely, maybe even lower pricing a little bit or give away some free users just to move the needle on the functionality. Because if we could just get them to, let's say, 60% of ideal functionality without even touching users or price, we would still triple the business. So it's one of these things where you need to sort of look at where the biggest gap is between where you are and what the potential is, and then work on that. So that's the expansion cube. And I call it 3D value because it is sort of it's a skill almost to understand this compounding nature of these three variables and how they interact and how you might work them in order to create business outcome. And it's a little bit also by, so to say, practicing what is the hardest to move, right? So if you have ideal functionality, metric, volume, and willingness to pay, like at some point you just say, I know I can raise prices, so let's just like capture that, and then we can, maybe that's quick and easy, and then we'll work on the cross-sells or upsells a little bit later. So that is that. And this sort of is the baseline where we see a lot of you, if you run this analysis and you're honest with yourself and actually just like do the bottom-up math, will find that you're sitting on several 100% of growth in your existing customer base. Like, and with your existing product, right? So one thing is that you can say, well, we could potentially add new use cases or new value in the product. And that would of course mean that the existing purchase that they have isn't sort of included. So we would have additional value, but even with what you have today, there might be a lot to gain. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about land and expand and a rant on that. And the rant is the following opinion. The perfect net revenue retention. The perfect net revenue retention is 100, meaning no growth. And I say it a little bit tongue in cheek, but here's what I mean. So what I see a lot is that people go for net revenue retention above 100, above 110, above 130, and they brag about it. But if it's constructed in a way where you just sell a absolutely minimal product on day one at a lousy price with just a few licenses, and then you work over time to just expand it, it's like, wouldn't you rather just sell the entire product with all the users at full price on day one and then just stay at that price forever instead of working yourself up to that price point? And I think the underlying dynamic here is that there is a certain dilemma that people are facing when we're talking about expansion revenue. And it is sort of one of these things where you say, if we have functionality and metrics and pricing, so the volume of product, the volume of, let's say, users or whatever the price driver is, and the price point, option one is to sort of go for a full-on purchase, like this is what you have to buy, and this is the volume that you have to buy, and the price is sort of at limit. So you just max out on everything, and you say, okay, I'm just going to sell you the whole thing on day one. That is a very hard sale. Like, you might swing it once or twice, but overall, it's just a really heavy lift to get customers to trust that giving you this much money on day one is the right thing to do. So instead, what people often do is that they go for, I should have called it option two here, but option two, which is like, you can start with one, like with the basic tier, with a couple of users, and we're going to give you a really good discount to start. So that is an easy sale, right? So the idea is that expansion revenue actually comes in as a fix for this hard sale, which is the full value day one sale that sort of potentially exists, but it's just really hard to realize. So my thinking about expansion revenue is that the key concepts of logic are, expansion is not the goal. And I see a lot of people sort of make it a goal in and of itself. And I think that's wrong, like straight up. It's just wrong. Because what it is it's a solve, it's a solution. It's the spreading out of sales over time to make the sale easier, right? So it's starting with an easy sale and then having to keep selling over time to then grow into that full value of the account. And then that creates what I call hidden CAC in the customer lifecycle, meaning that, okay, so the initial sale was whatever, cost you X, like $1,000 to make. But then you actually have to increase the number of modules that you sell them. You have to upsell them all the users. You actually have to work to increase the price. So all of these things are actually activities that might cost you money and then be spread out over time. And then that money, that cost, is actually something that you need to pay. And then, but often it goes sort of, let's say, it goes around your regular LTV CAC calculation, and it's sort of just often I see it just hidden in organizations, just like, we have all this, revenue, but we're actually not making any money because the whole organization is just, let's say, involved in just trying to create more value from customers, but it's just really cumbersome. And that creates point 4 here, which is like all CAC, hidden CAC can be effective or ineffective, meaning that it can be a good way to spend your money, or it can be a lousy return on investment. And then the final point is that since you get the money later, like since the whole point of spreading the sale out over time to make it easier is that you're now getting the money not on day 1, but on day whatever, 1,000 down the line, it should be more effective. Like it should have this idea where instead of spending just 50,000 in CAC on day 1 and getting the full value on the account, instead you spend, let's say, 5,000 in day 1 and then 1,000 every month for whatever 36 months, and then you end up with a collective CAC of, let's say, whatever 41,000, whatever the math is, and then it actually builds the account much more effectively than the day 1 sale. But if it doesn't, if it actually costs you more money because the hidden CAC is really hard to control and it just balloons out of control, then it actually isn't a good trade-off for you. So the idea is that expansion, like all other sales, needs sort of 3 components or steps in it. The customer must know that the product exists. So you need to let them know that, oh, I actually have another module. I actually have more users for you to buy, whatever it is. And then they must sort of realize what kind of value they're missing out on by not buying. And then you must give them an opportunity to buy. And all of these things have to be put together in a way where this is what the hidden CAC pays for, right? The hidden CAC actually says, hey, I have this extra module. You should take a look at it. It's really great. It does XYZ for you, which you're not getting today. That's the value gap. And you can buy it from me here. That's the opportunity. And then that can either be, effectively or non-effectively delivered. And I would also say sort of efficiently, meaning that it can work really well. Like you can have a really strong sales force that is really good at making all the upsells. It's just not very efficient in that the cost is high. And you can also have a very low cost model that's just very automated in generating these upsells. It just doesn't generate a lot of upsells. And that's actually sort of another point I have, which is that generally what I see is that sales-led growth is very effective in this hidden CAC, where product-led growth is very efficient. And you can almost like tell that it's true because almost all sales-led growth is looking to be more efficient. It's looking to drive down cost. It's actually because as long as we drive down cost, the unit economics works out because we can close. And what product-led growth, on the other hand, is trying to do is to become more effective, right? So product-led growth is super efficient, but often it doesn't work. Like it actually doesn't create the sale. It doesn't create the volume and the flow through and the growth of the account. So it's just one of these things where you need to have both to have really, really good and strong expansion sales and to be able to, let's say, spend your hidden CAC in the best way to then generate this value here. And I'm not a proponent for either. I actually think that the hybrid model of product and sales-led growth, like just more sales or more growth, is probably better. But of course, like it's the execution that really matters here. So with that, the third concept here, what you call the 2 expansion tracks. And what I see is that whenever we're trying to expand an account and we're saying, okay, let's go from whatever 100 to 200 in this account, we tend to have sort of 2 stakeholders to manage. And one stakeholder is the buyer. That's the decision maker who buys the solution to achieve what I call a global or like overall business outcome. And then you have the user who sort of operates and applies the solution that you're selling them to improve his or her local function, right? So let's make an example here. So HubSpot, for example, the buyer says, we need a CRM system and a marketing automation system to increase revenue. Like that's why you would buy HubSpot. And then the user that actually uses HubSpot said, hey, I need to build out these automation flows that we decided on, right? So they actually operate the software and put it into motion. So from a framework, a mental framework perspective, the buyer considers the solution an investment. Like, if I pay whatever, 30,000 a year for HubSpot, is that going to generate like enough sales compared to, let's say, another solution? So it's like, do I get the return on investment? Can I get more? Like, if I double my purchase with HubSpot, would I get even more value, and would that be worth it? That's sort of the thought of the person that writes the check. The user considers the solution a tool, which is like, can I get this particular thing done in my use case? And if yes, can I get something else done? And I think when you look at it like that, it also becomes clear that if they're not moving in the same cadence, if one is slower than the other, the expansion moves at the speed of the slowest track, right? So if the buyer thinks the ROI is there, but the user actually isn't able to, complete all the automations, then usually what happens is that the buyer will just wait for the user to catch up. Say, okay, so we're going to buy like more automation flows or more seats whenever we're actually done exploiting the existing package we have. And on the other end, if the buyer for some reason doesn't see the ROI in the product, it doesn't matter that the user really wants more product. The buyer's going to say, yeah, let's hold back a little bit and we'll postpone the decision. We'll buy more like next budget cycle or next year or whatever. And then, so it's sort of a lowest denominator case where it's the slowest track that determines the overall speed of the account. So with that, let's look at each track. So the buyer track first. Two key concepts here. One is what I call outcome-based pricing. I'll go over that in a second. And the second is what I call the expansion sales cycle. I'll go over that in a second as well. But the context here is the buyer considers the solution an investment. So the logic is something like, if I spend $1, how much do I get back? Like hopefully more than $1, right? And then the second question when investing is, how fast do I get it back, right? And you can also say, what's the risk? But let's just keep it these two. So if that's sort of the framework, let's look at how we can sort of work this. So imagine that you have a value chain, that the customer, as the buyer, is trying to create value in the business. And this is the model that we had all the way back from webinar number 1, where we talked about, webinar number 2, where we talked about pricing models. And so just imagine that you have like an AI platform, and it's sort of like step 1 in the value chain is that you create an AI model project and a team, and then they gather data and train models, and they deploy models, and the models work and make money to the business. One end is an input and one end is an output. So I actually don't want a team. I need a team in order to create the models that then make money, right? So at each of these points, we might measure different things that might be used as our pricing metric. So at the beginning, we might have users, and then in the middle, we might have something like gigabytes, and then at the end, we might have something like deployed models. And then, let's just say that the models then does the thing that I need the solution to do. But then now let's go a little bit further and add some numbers and some math here. So let's say that I have 10 users, 1 million gigabytes, and 100 models. And let's just say that I know that every model is going to make me around $100,000 a year. That also means that, let's say that I have some cost numbers associated to this. So let's say that the 10 users, they're expensive FTE, so that's 2 million fully loaded cost. It's 1 million in infrastructure cost on the gigabytes and another 1 million for the model. So that's 4 million of total cost. But since it's 100K a model in outcome, I spend the 4 million and I get 10 million out. So that's great. So before I pay for the solution that allows me to do this, I have a 100% ROI. So I put $1 in and I get $2.50 out, like 4 million, 10 million out. Okay, that's great. Now let's consider 2 ways to price this. One is an input-based pricing. So let's say that we add $500,000 of upfront cost in flat fees and user-based licenses and so forth to the solution. This now takes the total cost of the solution from 4 million to 4.5. And that means that the ROI now drops from 150 to 122. Like still good, but that's just how it is. Now compare that to what I would call outcome-based pricing. So outcome-based pricing would be a scenario where we say, dear customer, you know that models make you money. How about we only charge you for the models? And then we charge you the same 500K. But now we're positioning it in a way where we're just saying, once you have that, the model, we're just like going to add another 500K in cost. And really what we're going to do, maybe I should have put the 500K up under the revenue sign. What we really want to consider is this, that you get like $500,000 less out at the end, because it's just before you make money, that's when we charge. So if the math that you put up is like still 4 million in cost, but instead of 10 million out, now you just get 9.5 million out, the ROI actually increases to 138. So one element of outcome-based pricing is simply that it net in real terms increases the ROI, even though the spend on the customer side is the same. So there's a difference between adding the spend to the initial cost base, or let's say taking the spend and subtracting it from the value outcome at the end. It just generates different ROI. So the second point is, how fast do I get the money? And that is that if you charge on the input end, the 500K at the beginning, the customer has to sort of go through the entire process of creating a team, training the data, deploying the models, getting the outcome, before they realize that this is a really good ROI, it's 122%. So now I go back and I buy more users. And let's say you're selling this to banks, they might have a sales, like a value chain cycle of like 12 to 18 months before they realize this, it's proven to work, and they now buy more. But in another scenario where you just say, hey, I'm just going to charge you based on the models you put out, they might actually say, okay, that means that we can now add more users and we can add more volume, we can process more gigabytes, we can do all the things. And then that actually will get us to more models faster. So the time between you ask for money and they get paid is shortened, which also means that the iteration cycle is faster, so they will expand faster. So not only will they get a higher ROI from a percentage, they will also get the money back quicker, which means that they're going to invest at a higher cadence, so they're going to expand faster. On the user track, you might say that there's the speed of getting the job done, and then there is the fact that you can empower the user to buy. So if we solve for the commercial model in the buyer track, and we say, okay, we need the outcome-based pricing, and we need to have it, the whole expansion cycle squeezed in to sort of as short a possible amount of time as possible, that's what's going to create the most momentum in the buyer track. The user track, we say, and this is like, you could have more best practices here, but I would say the main thing is that it actually gets the job done, and it gets the job done fast. So it's the difference between wanting to do the job and just wanting it to be already done. And then is the, can you do other things for me? So in the speed of getting job done, I would say that the main asset you have is actually the product itself and the UI. So if you just want to create more user adoption, just create a great product, just create a great UI and something that just speeds everything up. Just remember that most users will try to remove all friction except themselves, right? So let's say you have customer success software, and the customer success people will be more and more efficient, and they will do a better and better job, except that they will never actually fire themselves and just automate the whole thing. So that is when you actually need to go back to the buyer level and say, hey, the solution actually, it can make this whole department redundant, and you should just move it out, because that department on the user level will never do that themselves. And then when you empower the customer to buy, or the user to buy, we're back to this sort of same three-step sales model where you say the customer must know the product exists, the value gap must be felt, so what is it that I'm getting? And then the customer must have an opportunity to buy. And I think building that into the product, where in number one, you just show them what's for sale in the interface. So this can be anything from, you have a tab in your web app that's grayed out that says advanced analytics. And then when they click it, they say, hey, you need to buy this to actually get access. So it's just one of these things where, and product-led growth does a great job of just explaining all these mechanics, but it's just one of the things where they must know the product exists. And if the product doesn't do it, then you need the salespeople or the customer success team or someone else to tell them that something is for sale. very often when I do product cleanups, packaging cleanups for clients, one of the issues they face is that the product has grown so big that customers actually don't know what kind of modules or add-ons or features are for sale. So that's why they're under purchased. Second, you need to give them a taste, which can be a free trial or a like basic version of a feature, and they need to pay for the advanced version or any of the sort. We say, hey, here's the actual sort of gap. It's very concrete. We're saying this is for sale. This is what you could get if you have the full thing. So any kind of motion to give them a taste is what solves for the second thing. And then finally, you have two versions of getting them an opportunity to buy. One is the honorable one, where you say, I just got one from Monday today that said, to monday.com, that said, you have too many users on your solution. We are going to ask you to, buy something else. So to buy more users. And then the, let's say, less honorable but more effective one is to just have all the different users be able to do stuff inside the solution that then triggers invoicing. So it's just essentially to diffuse the buying power away from the core economic buyer and down into the user organization and just have them drive it. So I think a lot of, for example, Slack with the monthly active users that they had actually was user driven to some extent. You have other, I think Figma at one point had every user had the ability to add other creators or users to the Figma profile, and then they would be priced. So these kinds of plays. All right. A little bit mindful of time, but I think we're getting close. So let's do it. Fourth, renewals and best practices. So two concepts with renewals. One is what I call continuous onboarding and sales. And the second one is contract frameworks. And then, that's the wrap on what I have to say about expansion and renewals. So the first one I think is actually important. So continuous onboarding and sales. Is that if you're at the point of renewal and you're trying to say, hey, I think you should renew, like I think you should buy another year, what do you think about that? Then the customer is facing a decision where they're saying, okay, where am I today, the present, and then I'm comparing that to a possible future. And then that's sort of, okay, so what kind of value am I getting and what kind of sort of risk am I taking when, I'm considering this sort of future state. So that's it. That's any renewal conversation ever. Like, do you want to buy again, right? Yeah, okay, let me think through what that means for my life, right? And then my only argument here is that is a lot easier to have that conversation if the buyer is already fully aware of and able to compare that to a past state, to the present, and what kind of value is already delivered. So this is a little bit the what have you done for me lately concept, where if you continuously communicate to the customer, say, let me tell you what I have done for you lately. Let me tell you all the value. So for example, which you use Loom, they constantly tell you how many hours of meetings you've saved, right? And it's just a way where products are really good at communicating the value and saying, with the usage you have, you save this much, or you earn this much, or you have this kind of value, and just communicating it constantly back, both to the user level, but also to the buyer level, because that, when it's time for renewal, makes it a lot easier to say, hey, do you want to continue or maybe even buy some more? Because the ROI is so present and well explained. So the best practices I have for sort of executing that is to actually first have really good services. So if you have really good premium support and you just generally have like awesome services overall, that is just a massive value add for people to constantly understand what kind of value you bring. So if you were at the services webinar, I think a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this sort of taxi B concept where there's just, you can get people to the airport in a lot of different ways. And one of them is just vastly more valuable than the other. So that is one thing. And then this point of measuring and show value constantly, where you would constantly, for example, like Loom do, how much you're using it, how many hours of meeting are you saving, and so forth. And then the last thing that I think that people miss out on is that if you constantly analyze your successful customers and say, okay, so customers who use my solution that have the most success, that generate the most sales or have the most usage of Loom or generate the most leads or have the most opportunity in HubSpot or whatever it is, what are they doing? And you might say, oh, like they have a minimum of these users and the users have these profiles and they started off in this way and they attended all the onboarding calls and whatever it was, right? So if you just have that, maybe they're integrating into certain systems and so forth. If you constantly measure what your successful customers do specifically, then you can take that behavior and then try to apply it to all the other customers as well. So you can say, you can go back into your onboarding process and say, hey, it's really important that you attend at least 2 people, that one of them is an engineer, that you make sure to integrate this thing really, really quickly, or we'll do it for you, or whatever it is, and then get that into the process. And then that feedback loop of constantly asking customers what they're doing and then using it to rework the process and just create more success, then measure and show that value, and then support it with really good services is really going to help you when it comes time for renewal. Last point on contracts. So poor contracts are contracts that expire and need consent to renew, and they also require consent on price and product changes. So it's one of these things that, we have a contract for a year, and then, a year from now, we'll renegotiate. But the price is whatever, 100, and the product is X, and that's sort of fixed until we agree otherwise. This is what I call a heavy renewal, and you have to play defense because you have to go into the meeting and essentially just start by defending existing value. So you're spending hidden CAC to just get back to zero, to get back to your current ACV. Contrasted to good contracts, which auto-renew, like just automatically goes into the next billing period, and then also allows you to unilaterally, which means without consent, to change price and product. So it would be something like, hey, welcome to January 1st. The price just went up from 100 to 110. We added these features. We took these features out. Have a nice day. If we need to talk, let's talk. But then I'm actually going to play offense because what I'm trying to do now with my time and my hidden CAC in my customer relationship is to actively advertise, demonstrate value, and close upsells. So those were the 3 activities where you make it known that you have more for sale, you make the value gap apparent, and you actually give them an opportunity to buy. So the renewals that are most valuable to companies get to spend their time and energy on upsells and expansion revenue exactly because the contracts have already done the defense. So that's the point. Okay, we're done. Let's call that 30 minutes of presentation. So now we have about sort of 15 minutes for questions, and I see we have a bunch of questions, so that is awesome. And we also have about just shy of 40 people. So really glad to have you all hang in here. So I'm just going to take the questions from the top down. And as you remember, any questions that I don't get into, I'll just copy paste them into a community thread on the school community. It's here, school.com/SaaS-pricing/about. Go in there if you're not already a member. Join. It's super easy. You can get access in a minute. It's free. And then we'll have the discussion in there. Okay, so to the question. AK asks, does it make sense to sell cheap to start with as it will anchor the value of your product and thus the investment from customer may be subpar? Not to talk about pushing price higher will be difficult. So I think it's always easier to solve for higher customer value, right? So I think if you have whatever 100 of value, then you need to charge less than 100 to get them to buy. Let's say, accept the premise of the economic principle here. So there needs to be some sort of what we call customer surplus. But I think what people often do is that they consider product value almost fixed. So they're like, oh, we're just going to charge 50 or 40 or 30 or 20 or 10 and just try to make that like a better purchase. Instead of trying to really say, how can we deliver 1,000 of value and then charge 200? Right? And I think if you have that mindset that you constantly need to chase more value for your accounts, usually the fair price will tend to follow. If you keep the value relatively fixed and just discount away, that's usually a race to the bottom. So especially if you're starting out, just do whatever pricing and just focus everything you can on getting feedback from customers to increase value. And then once you hit sort of 1 to 3 million ARR, if that's sort of the beginning, then you can start to sort of rework and do a little bit more, let's say, value-based or let's say just fair pricing. And then you work your way up to, let's say, a position where you have where you really can scale 15 million ARR or so, let's say on a good model. and then you can go from there. But in the beginning, I think it's also like, it's the wrong way to ask the question, if that makes sense. Like, because it sort of tends to focus on the wrong thing, which is the price point and not the value creation of the product. I hope that that makes sense, AK. Okay, so Johnny has a question here. How does expansion happen in practice? What leads to most success? For example, access to feature to try it and then call from sales to convert. And follow up, what is a good ROI generally for product sales? We are running at 300%, but you said 120% is good. So I think the 120 was just an example, right? So whenever you have 120% on an ROI, so what I didn't put in there was the time frame, right? So if the time frame is a week, if I get my money back twice, I'm just going to do that as many times as I possibly can. If the money back is 3 years, maybe I have better opportunities, right? So the time frame really matters when you're calculating ROI. So you need to have apples to apples there. How does it happen in practice? I think actually every business is different, and I think people are working it out for their products. I think the traditional way was to go and sell it, and then you now have a big product-led motion, and I think learning what works from both is probably what's going to be best for you, right? I think with that, also the price point that you sell at will really give you some indication. So if you sell it, let's say sub 1,000 a year, then you're going to have to be fully product led, right? You can't really have sales spend time on low value tickets. But let's say if you're above 50K or above 100K, it's especially if you start out relatively high, then you almost definitely will need sales to make that trust happen to close that account, right? With a few exceptions, such as very horizontal softwares like Atlassian and so forth that just grows in Asia and the cloud platforms. But they actually also tend to have a lot of brand at this point. So I think it's sort of figuring out what your ticket size is, figure out what works for you, and then finding the right mix is usually good. And I had this comment on the efficiency versus the effectiveness as well. Okay, so Philip asks, is there a difference between output-based pricing and value-based pricing? I have seen people use it as a synonym. Okay, so not really. And I prefer output-based pricing because sometimes people tend to, like in the example I used with users coming first and then models coming late, I have seen people say, hey, we want a value price, but we value price the users, which sort of means that they want to price according to the value getting out of the system. So they essentially want the price point, the number that you charge, to correlate with the outcome for the customer, which is fine. I just don't think it's very helpful, right? Because you can value price the users or you can value price the models. And my argument just is it's just a lot easier to think of it in terms of outcome-based pricing, because that actually moves you to the end of the value chain where that actually can happen, right? And because people get stuck on this sort of, let's say, fairness aspect of it, where they're making millions of our software, we're only charging pennies. And then they're missing the point where they might be orchestrating their pricing in a way that isn't very easy to justify for the customer, or is generating a lot of risk, or whatever it is. And then, so the outcome-based focus, I think, is the right way to solve the problem and actually charge more money rather than just think about it in more general terms like value. So that's my answer. Adrian then answers Philip here, let's say, and say, hey, I think value-based pricing is more about the price point, whereas output-based pricing is more about the pricing metric. You said it perfectly. I should just have read your answer here. So Claudio then asks, interesting, the concept past compared to present. It's what Amazon is doing with Prime, highlighting for each purchase how much money you are saving on the delivery. Exactly. So I think actually especially a lot of really good product-led growth companies, but actually if you think about it, a lot of really good sales-led growth companies are doing a lot of this. They're spending a tremendous amount of time and effort to really design the way in which the product or the service or the people involved in the process are communicating the value already delivered, right? Because it's just a really, really strong base to work off of when you have to do the expansion or the renewal, right? Philip then asks again, please say a lot more about the hidden COG. It seems to be such an important concept for all of this. It's just one of, so you have different sort of versions of this, but it's where you're saying, let me approach it from another angle. So some of you will know who've been in the game of SaaS for a long time, that every time you have a fresh SaaS business, right, and you're sub 5 million or whatever, you always have this idea that, as long as we get more customers, it's going to scale. So right now, maybe we're not even break even, or maybe we're like kind of break even, but when we get to 100 million, we're going to have tremendous margins. Like it's just going to be like 60% profit margin. And it just never happens. Like very, very rarely does it actually happen. And even at larger scales, once you hit 1, 2, 3, 500 million, very often you actually see very anemic, let's say low margins of, let's say 5, 10, maybe 20%, but nowhere near the sort of like what the Excel sheet said when you were at 5, right? So something happens when you just like balloon up a SaaS business where it's like, and most people are like, what the heck? Like where's all the money going? Like we're making 100 million top line. Why aren't we actually taking some of this back? And I think a lot of it is just that the operational load of the whole system is just sort of sucking in activity to just plug holes and do things. And one of the ways is, let's say, where I see a lot of people spending a tremendous amount of money is in the renewal phase. It's just like, so this $100 million US based company I was talking about, 400 enterprise account, the average contract cycle length is about, let's say 2 years. So let's say every year they have 200 enterprise accounts that they need to renegotiate, so renew. And they have what I call the poor contract framework. So the contracts actually time out. They don't have to auto renew. They have fixed prices and product and so forth. So if you have to renegotiate 200 contracts every year with 200 procurement departments from enterprise like blue chip companies, that's almost one a day, like not counting weekends. But that means that you have, and you can just imagine, like, what does it take to renegotiate an enterprise account? Well, maybe, I don't know, 20 days, like total all in before you have the business case, if you had all the meetings and you've done all the prep work and all the things. So it's just a tremendous amount of people, like expensive sales FTEs that need to be involved in the process, which is painful. Like it's a lot of, pulling teeth from these procurement departments. They're on the defense and so forth. So it's not enjoyable work. And at the end, you end up with the same price that you had before. So no value is created, but you have a team of like 30, 40 people running around doing nothing else than just keeping the status quo. But what doesn't happen is that it actually doesn't get often included in the customer acquisition cost. A little bit dependent on where the division of labor is. So for example, if it sits in like account management or customer success, I would actually argue that this is because it is a revenue generating activity. But whenever you're measuring the COG, like how much does it actually cost us to have a new customer, you're usually just measuring what it costs to get that customer on day one, but you're not measuring what it actually costs us to renew that customer and keep the customer over time. So you might call that delivery cost. And so accounting principles might vary. Let's say fairly argue that this is not COG, it's delivery cost or service cost or cost to serve. I accept that, but I'm just inviting you to consider it almost like a revenue generating cost, and then just consider it, let's say, on the same efficiency and effectiveness metrics as you would normal COG, like paid advertising or whatever, and then get that in there. Final question. Steven says, what are your thoughts on including a price increase clause in contracts? For example, your contract will auto renew and the price will increase by the greater of CPI or 5%. So it's not what I would call best practice, but it's definitely better than most, right? So for example, auto renew, you should be able to get that into all contracts. Like at the state of where SaaS is today, even when you're selling to defense or you're selling into RFPs for government or whatever, having auto renew functions should be the case. And you can actually argue that, say, hey, we don't want to spend the time renegotiating with you guys. So if you want to churn, just go ahead and churn. But if we are to talk, we actually want to talk about what's next and not what happened in the past. So we have auto renew. And then the problem with the CPI of 5% or greater off is that you now capped yourself, right? So let's say that your product just increased in value by 20%. Or let's say that it just increased by 5%, but your largest competitor just went bankrupt, right? You probably could raise prices more, right? But now your contract is locking you in, right? So you're faced now with either the opportunity to just under monetize, that's not favorable, or you say, hey, this new feature I have, I'm going to spin it out on the side and then I'm going to try and sell it to my customers. And now that actually creates additional COG because you have to go to all the customers and present the new feature and then try to sell it to them. You're not going to get 100% attach rate. So it actually creates technical complexity. It creates a little bit of what I call commercial debt as well. So variance in customer frameworks and contracts. And so while it is better than the worst possible contract, it has some downstream long-term effects that are usually unfavorable. So I would just bite the bullet in my contracts and say, we get to raise prices to what we see fit. And then you get to leave if you don't like it. And then in the communication with the customer, you say, hey, we're going to index regulate. Like that's sort of the promise. And then we're always going to market test our prices. And then whatever the market accepts when we're selling to new clients, that's also what in time our existing client base will get. Like that's it. So that means that whenever you have an idea for launching new pricing, you do it for new sales first. If it works, then you roll that back to your existing legacy base, and then you keep everyone on track with your most recent pricing. Okay, everyone, thank you so much. So again, if you want, you can go to the school.com community. I'll upload the webinar recording a little bit later today. And we actually sort of ran out of questions. That's the first. But if you have another question, just post it in there, and I'll get to it today or tomorrow. It's a pleasure doing these webinars. And remember that next week we have the grand finale on how to run a B2B SaaS pricing project. So October 2nd, Wednesdays, 3 o'clock Central European and 9 a.m. Eastern. So I'm looking forward to that. See you all there. Have a great day.